Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Erika Heald, and it's noon Pacific on Monday, so it's got to be content chat, right? Well, I sure hope so. I hope that's why you're here. Of course, if you are watching the archive, it may not be Monday, and I'm very sad that you couldn't join us in person because it's always so much more fun in person, where you can ask me and our lovely guests questions and hear from all of your content marketing peers. Today, we're going to be talking about thought leadership, which, as you know, is one of my all-time favorite things to work on. And I'm excited that I have Kathy Casciani here today, who is also a huge thought leadership nerd. Nerd being enthusiast, and awesome person, not anything geeky in a bad way. I think
No,
geeky is a
we're
good
not
thing.
taking it the wrong way there. Nerdy is a
Excellent.
compliment.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Kathy. And can you give folks a little bit of info about who you are and what you do and how you got started working on thought leadership stuff?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Erica. I'm excited to be here. I am a 20 plus, so we'll leave it at that, 20 plus year veteran of public relations. I have worked probably mostly on the agency side, a little bit on the client side, started my career in the music industry and have since really worked mostly with consumer products companies as well as service businesses. And I would say, especially for service businesses, thought leadership is such a crucial strategy. I do a lot of work with founders and experts within companies, really just, helping them turn their expertise into media hits, essentially. But yes, I'm kind of a PR lifer, and I started my own little consultancy last year. So I am now out on my own instead of working for an agency. So it's been an exciting year.
Love it. As a fellow solopreneur, it's
Yes,
always so
love it.
exciting and fun because you get to focus on what you like. But
Exactly.
before we jump into all of this, you said something that made my spidey sense tingle
Ooh.
because my background before I got into doing content for companies, I was a magazine journalist, and I also
Oh,
did a lot of writing in San Francisco around arts and entertainment. So talk to me about what kind of music PR you did, because now I'm like, I
ah,
wonder if our paths crossed in a, different life.
maybe they did. Yes. So actually, my first, the first half of my career in public relations was actually in the music industry. I worked right out of college for a big PR agency called the Mitch Schneider Organization, working with, I mean, they had everybody. It was, bands from like Ozzy Osbourne, Kiss, Ted Nugent, Janet Jackson. We actually represented Prince when he went to the Symbol, which was kind of a
Wow.
crazy thing. I remember installing the symbol font on our computer. It was kind of odd. And then I actually worked in house for about 4 or 5 years for a record company called Epitaph Records, which was
I
mostly,
know them.
yes, punk rock and ska band. So that was kind of my days living in Los Angeles. But it was a really great entree into public relations. I learned a lot. Had a lot of fun experiences. Let's put it that way.
That's amazing. I think we all need to have some sort of music in our work lives. It definitely has good cocktail hour stories, if nothing else.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, we'll go out for cocktails and we can definitely swap some stories
Sounds
about our
good.
days or my younger days. So,
Excellent. Oh, hi, Amy Fair. It's always so nice to see a familiar face in there. Amy is definitely somebody that we'd want to have those cocktails with while trading
okay,
the
Amy,
off-the-record stories.
we're on. We're on.
All right. So let's just sort of set some ground expectations for when you're thinking about implementing any kind of a thought leadership program, be it for a client or in-house, because you're either the head of PR or the head of content marketing. What are those qualities that we really need to be looking for to identify the right thought leader who's going to be able to be that person that we go to for that content creation, for tap them for speaking engagements, and just being a really good media relations person? Because frequently everybody focuses on the CEO to the exclusion of everyone else. And let's be clear, CEOs have a lot of things to do that frequently don't include those three things.
Absolutely. I mean, I think just on a very basic level, you want to look for that person who's, that sort of authentic personality, but just has an experience that is worth sharing that somehow ties clearly to your business. So, obviously you need that person to be willing to put themselves out there, someone who has that strong point of view. about a topic or, something about your industry. And again, I think it's important that somehow that connects to whatever your business is, so that when they're out there sharing their expertise, that's somehow going to lead people, to your business. To your point, yes, it is always, I think, in the perfect world, your founder or CEO is willing to put themselves out there, at least for some areas of expertise. I just actually recently finished, I don't know if you've read A Founder Brand by Dave Gerhardt.
Oh, I haven't. I'll put it on my list.
Really great book about, how as a founder, you can really turn your story into a competitive advantage for your company, and just all the ways you can do that. It's a great read. Highly recommend it. But, and I think it's just, a lot of founders and CEOs, yes, they don't have time. And a lot of them don't necessarily sort of believe in it. They don't believe that, if they spend all this time, whether it's posting, on a blog or on social, that it'll benefit their business. But I think done strategically, it very much can do that. But I also agree, you're right. There are people within an organization who can definitely serve that role as well. Just to give you an example, I work with a company called Free Model, also based in the Bay Area, and it's a home renovation company, and they have a whole team of interior designers. And, many of them are really vocal about subject, like home decor kind of subject matter. And so we've frequently leveraged them for media opportunities, like say someone from Martha Stewart Living, wants somebody that has a strong point of view on the Barbie core trend or whatever it is. So a lot of times we'll work with designers who say, I have an opinion on that, I want to share it, and turn that into a media opportunity or a blog post. So
That's just so smart to really think about, what that whole collective group of people looks like that you can tap into. And I think that's
yes.
especially true when you're thinking about wanting to have informed content curation. So that way you're sharing on your company pages things that are really relevant and compelling and that you can take a stand on or share a point of view on. I've
Absolutely.
personally used Flipboard quite a bit for doing that, because you can invite multiple people to participate. And so it kind of becomes a more efficient way of keeping in one place all those links that somebody says, oh, hey, we should share this, and here's why. So instead of having that,
Yes.
searching through the emails, you actually just have that one place to go and look, which for me at least is nice, because I don't know about you, but I have a lot of unread emails.
Yes, my inbox is not something you want to look at right now. And yes, and I think that's a really good point, just coming up with a system. But I think it's, to your point of who, it's, doing that audit of who do we have in our organization that might have, opinions or expertise that we want to leverage in some way. So really looking at the
Totally.
whole organization.
So I'm going to share a pet peeve that I have, and I've had this pet peeve for a long time because, like you, I've been in marketing for over 25 years. So I have a lot of strongly held opinions. And the first one is that you can't have thought leadership without thoughts from the leader. You
Oh,
cannot just
good.
assign an intern at the PR agency or at the company to come up with content. It's not going to be compelling.
No,
It's not going to have the wisdom. It's not going to have all that experience.
no.
So, how do you get at some of those unique experiences that are going to be really compelling and interesting for media pitches? Like, how do you even figure out that there's some there?
Yes, and that is definitely one of my pet peeves as well. You cannot outsource the thought leadership. Like, I think yes, you can have somebody help you articulate, but I think the thoughts have to be there, right? You can't ask Google or Chat GPT or the intern for any of that. So, I think usually what happens, just if I look at my process when I start with a client, and even before we sign on the dotted line, it's really looking at, having that initial kind of deep dive, I call it a story mining session. You sit with the principals and you really kind of dig in and ask questions about, what are, ask about their background, talk about sort of, what their expertise is and how that might relate to the business. And just, I tend to spend at least a couple of hours up front on sort of that initial discovery work. I usually kind of come up with a questionnaire to kind of get to those things. And then I have a whole list of things that I ask for, whether it's, past credentials or, schooling, any backgrounders, any past media work that they may have done. But just trying to kind of intake as much as I can and sort of dig through that to just really sort of pull out those themes. Ideally coming up with, 2 to 3 kind of content pillars that you might kind of work through. And then I try to tend to plan about 3 months at a time. So, don't just do it once at the start of, when you work with someone, is like keep revisiting that and saying, like, okay, what's coming up in the world? Are there holidays? Are there occasions? Are there things happening in your business? And then how do we sort of take your expertise and marry that to like what's going on in the world and kind of create pitches and angles and ideas from there?
I love that. And, I second the opinion that you've got to be doing this planning and these discovery sessions on an ongoing
Yes.
basis
Mhm.
because, it's something that they had, if they have a conversation in a meeting with a partner, or if they've just, if an executive just was the one who did a demo for someone at an important company that they're hoping to close. So
Right.
frequently, when you ask them about those conversations, you'll hear something interesting that you've never heard before that you can really kind of dig into as well. So I
For
like
sure.
I I'm a fan of inviting those folks to the regular meeting. Make maybe not the every week meeting, but at least once a month,
Right.
having those folks in the planning sessions. So that way they see what you've got in the pipeline, and you can just ask them. So, hey, I know you met with this partner last week. What did you guys talk about? What were they really psyched about that you showed them? And they just really, I don't know. I personally just find that it really helps spark some ideas that way too.
Yeah, and I think that just as you get to know clients or people that you work with, like things come out, they share information about themselves that maybe they didn't share initially. And you're like, oh, I can leverage that. We can use that. I didn't realize that, you had that certification. So
Exactly.
I think it's just constantly having those check-ins.
Agreed. Now, for your intake process, do you have your kind of like a bespoke template that you always follow, or a checklist? Or I always love to hear how people approach intake, because I've been on the receiving end occasionally, working with clients who've hired PR agencies, entire agencies, not even just a consultant, who's come in and they have no onboarding process, they have no intake checklist, and you're like, oh my gosh, how on earth is this going to work? Because
Yes,
that's frightening. So it sounds like you have a good process. So I'd love to
I
hear a little bit
do.
about how
I
you do that.
mean, I kind of have a standard questionnaire that I use, but I always kind of amend it just depending on the client. And, I like to have those basic questions up front. I have a list of all the assets and things I ask for.
Yeah,
But, again, depending on the nature of the business, I always try and customize it a little bit. So, but that's kind of the first thing I do. You know, Before you get too far down the path, you want to kind of see what's there.
agreed. So
Sorry,
one
I'm
of
like
the
to death here.
I know I get you talking, so you got
I
to have some
know.
water. So
Ah,
please
there
do
we go.
not
Yeah.
hesitate to drink water. I'm prepared. I
No.
have my
Mm.
Dr. Zevia, and I have some LaCroix because
Yes.
I drink a lot of water over the course of a day.
Indeed,
So
indeed.
now, one of the other pet peeves I have is sometimes when you have somebody who's tapped to do media relations in particular, who does not love doing that kind of stuff, they feel
Yes.
really compelled to stick to the messaging points that you've outlined. And like they can't
Yes.
make eye contact on a video chat. They can't, just off the top of their head, speak to whatever it is. They've tried to memorize whatever it is. They can't memorize it. So then they're stressed out, then they're reading it and it comes across as awkward. Like how do you help people not get in that trap of, wanting to just answer every question like they're a political candidate with whatever their brand messaging and
Right.
things are. How do you get them to like balance, okay, sure, you need to sound like you are the head of this company or you're a contributor for this company, but
Right.
you want them to share their actual experience and have a valuable conversation with whoever's interviewing them. Like, do you have some tips for
Yeah.
helping
I
people
mean,
that happen?
I think it does come down to practice at the end of the day. And especially because I feel like a good place to start is, so many reporters these days want commentary. They won't necessarily pick up the phone and do a phone interview anymore or a video, they'll do it via writing. So at least
Yeah.
I think we have a chance to work on things that way. But I mean, I think just reinforcing the idea of that you want to start from a place of being helpful, right? Like you have to think, who is the audience? Like, and it's not about your product. Like that should not be your first concern. You should be worried about answering the questions in a way that's going to help, genuinely help the audience that you're trying to serve. I think also just what we see is, sometimes they might go for those like one word, one sentence answers, because they're busy. And so I think it's just reinforcing the idea that, you have to give, you really have to kind of make sure you have that lengthy answer. You want to really make sure you have your own personal point of view in there. I think that's the other mistake I see is just, you know, again, people take the lazy way out, and they think, oh, if it's something that Chat GPT or it looks like Google answered it, then, you're not really bringing yourself into the answer. And I think the reason that reporters want a subject matter expert is because they want your expertise and your personal experience with the subject matter to be a part of that. And I think that really needs to come through. But I do think it just comes down to practice and just trying to step back from what am I trying to sell or what am I trying to, get across and say, like, how can I be of service and answer the question in a way that it's going to really help the audience that's hearing it.
And that being of service to your audience is critical for content marketing too. To me, it's like if you're not doing that first and foremost, then it's just content. It's not actually content marketing because you're not going to build a relationship when you're talking about yourself and your product and your company when that's not what somebody was asking you.
No, exactly. Like it's not a good way to build trust. First of all, people can smell that stuff a mile away. It's like, oh, they're just trying to plug their product or service and they're not really answering the question, and not only that, the journalist will see it. And a lot of times if the journalist doesn't get the quality answers that they want that are, there to help the audience, then they might not even use your commentary. They might not use your quotes. So it's really in your
100%.
best interest to, to be to answer the question and not try and make it about you. It's not really about you. It's about the audience, so.
Exactly. And I mean, if you have something boring to say or something safe to say that, everyone else is going to be saying too, then they're going to pick the person with the fanciest title from the most well-known company to be the one to say that. So you really do have to, if you want to be quoted, it has to be a perspective they haven't heard before. It has to be something
Exactly.
that makes people stop. It's like, what would you say if you were talking to somebody in person and a person that you knew asked you this question? Would you,
Exactly.
and if you answer it in that kind of more conversational manner, even with the don't start with your first answer, start with the second part of the answer, which is when they come back and say, but why? Because inevitably, if somebody doesn't know what you're talking about, they'll say, but why? Why would you do that? And then you tell them
Yep.
the next level down. That is almost always so much more interesting than what you started with.
Absolutely. Yep, you're right. And a lot of times it isn't rocket science. It's just, well, how would you normally answer the question, and not trying to think about plugging your product. Like you almost have to just disconnect yourself from that. And of course, if there's a natural way to weave that in, great. But at the end of the day, you're trying to be of service to the reporter and the reader.
Exactly. So, in that same kind of vein, when you are in the position of pitching your thought leader for some sort of, let's say, let's do a media outlet first, because I do think that we do these things a little bit differently. So if you, let's say you have a goal of having, 3 substantial conversations with a reporter on your subject matter for that person, what is the right way to approach that media outlet or a specific journalist in order to really make your thought leader shine and make it easier for them to say yes?
Okay, so yes, I have many, many thoughts on this. So first of all, I'll start with a couple things that I think most people get wrong. So first of all, you don't want to sort of start with the pitch slap, right? You want to start actually. First thing is really do your research, because I think where people go wrong, I would say 90% of the time, is actually pitching the wrong thing to the wrong journalists. I cannot tell you, that is probably a journalist's number one pet peeve, is that all these things land in their inbox that are not relevant to them. They are not relevant to their beat. They're not relevant to what they write about. And unfortunately, too many people are just kind of somehow obtaining a media list and blasting, 100 people the same pitch. And for most of them, it's not even relevant. So I'd say first and foremost, like really research the people you're pitching, make sure that what you're pitching them like actually relates to what they write about on a day-to-day basis. So that would be my first thing. And then the second thing I would really recommend is before you even pitch, follow them on social media, like look at kind of what they're posting about, and maybe, think about sharing an article that they've written, maybe reposting it on your end with some of your own thoughts about it. You might want to comment on something that they've, a lot of times journalists will, they'll share their own articles on Twitter or LinkedIn, and
Yeah.
you might think about commenting on it. And so ideally, maybe that person by the time you pitch them has already kind of seen your name. So I would say like do those two things first, and kind of it's just going to soften things up a little bit. And then when you're ready to pitch, I'd say a couple things. First of all, really be mindful of that subject line, right? It's so important because, they're unfortunately journalists are just deluged with pitches. And so you really want to make sure that that subject line is short and sweet, and that it really is going to indicate what's inside the email. Like too many people try and be very clever, and it's like, oh, if I'm, or vague. And then they're just hoping like somebody's going to open your email. Like you got to give an idea of what's going to be in the pitch to get them to open it. And then last but not least, in your pitch, I would say just make it short, make it sweet, try and, make sure you're getting it through in like a first short paragraph. And if you have additional information you want to share, or, maybe links to other articles that your subject matter expert has, been featured in before, like put that at the end. But you want to just grab them with like a quick short pitch, because reporters are just overwhelmed with their inboxes. So I don't know, those are just a few bits of advice that I would give to anyone who's trying to pitch.
I think those are fantastic tips, especially at the idea of at the bottom, including some, relevant links, especially like if you've been honing their thought leadership platform by having them post on your blog. That way you can say, here's, some of the stuff that they've recently, published on this topic. So that way the journalist can skim it and see, is this person offering a different point of view? And if you're doing your job right, then they will have been, having a unique point of view that resonates with people. And that will actually make the journalist make their job easier to see that it's somebody who will actually have something to say, rather than somebody who's going to sit there and go, oh, yes, I make software and our software is so great. There's no other software. We have no competitors. Like no journalist wants to talk to that person.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's nice just to sort of prove if they've had some experience with media, or if there's additional things you want to share, like kind of sticking them at the end. But you've got to just make sure you get that initial pitch, try and just edit it back, because they're probably going to glance at it pretty quickly.
Mhm.
Ideally in the pitch, you want to capture, what things they're uniquely positioned to talk about, and try and make it something, where, they're just pick their strong points, right? Like what are the things that they are really like, they're really experienced talking about. But yeah, I'd say just try and keep it short and sweet. That's my best advice.
Love that. So now on the flip side, when you're talking about pitching your subject matter expert, your thought leader as a contributor for, a blog post or an article to, either a publication that accepts bylines or op-eds, or to an industry blog that is always looking for ongoing contributors, what are your tips for, putting together the right pitch that says that you're not just going to be one of those spammy contributor people who's doing it for the SEO backlink? Because I certainly get a ton of those pitches every day and I report them as spam. I'm not going to lie. When I get stuff for my blog and it's about cell phones, those get put in the spam filter immediately.
Right. Well, and maybe you can speak to this. This is maybe where I want to hear from you then too. But I mean, I have personally found that some reporters want just sort of a quick blurb about what it's going to be about, and then I think the other thing that really works is to write the whole article sometimes and then just shop it out. But again, I think it goes back to not being self-serving, right? I think you have to really look at what other content are they doing. How can I write something that's going to be truly helpful, to the readership of this publication or blog or whatever it is. And what is it about my experience that will show the editor that I can provide a unique take on this, and spell that out. Say, maybe, other people are talking about X, but I think about it differently. Like, what's my sort of contrarian take on this subject? So again, I do think it comes down to knowing how a reporter likes to be pitched, and whether they kind of want to see the blurb first or whether writing the whole article out, sometimes that honestly makes it easier for them to just say yes. They can read it and
Yeah.
say whether they want it or not, and give the editor or reporter a few days or a week to make their decision. And if they don't respond to you, you move on to the next person. So, but yes, I don't know if you have any other tips on that subject, but contributed articles is another way of getting the thought leadership out there.
I agree with everything that you said. And, the only thing I'd really add is you have to make sure that your thought leader is going to be willing to engage in the comments. So
Really good.
if it's a publication that actually has comments turned on, they're going to have the expectation that whoever authors something is in there responding to the readers.
Right.
The same way on social media. So it's got to be somebody who has that conviction and they're willing to get in there and get a little scrappy. Because I think if you're not, then maybe you get that one placement, but then you kind of burn that bridge and they're not going to take another, piece from you because you're not engaging their audience. You're, dropping the clickbait and running. And, maybe somebody will do that once and not take it down immediately. But I just don't think that's going to be a great way to build that kind of ongoing relationship.
You
Um,
actually, that's a fantastic point, and I think that actually is maybe just to add on to your question before. When you're thinking about building relationships with reporters, let's just say you are included in a story. I think it's really important for you to post the article on your social channels and thank the reporter, tag them in, wherever you're sharing it, because that might mean that they come back to you, for another story. So I think it's not this sort of closed loop thing, like now they've ran it and I'm kind of on to the next thing. Like, you want to keep that relationship going for the future, and also make the most of the content. If you get included in a story in Martha Stewart Living or Inc. or whatever it is, don't just assume people are going to read it. Like, you've got to share it
yeah.
and get the most mileage out of it possible.
I'm always just so sad when you get that kind of a placement and then you can't get the person to actually share the piece. I mean, in
It's
the perfect world for me, I swoon when I see that, usually it's the CEO that I've pinned something for because I've interviewed it out of them. We've gotten it placed. When they say, "Oh, look, I'm so proud of this article I wrote that appeared in TechCrunch," and they're sharing it on LinkedIn, that just like makes me feel like, yes, I have won my career, because I've been able to
yes,
capture someone's voice and their perspective. And they're so thrilled that they probably even believe that they wrote it because they wrote those words. I wrote this and I'm so proud of it because for them, they did because they told you what they wanted to say and you captured it, you packaged it, and you made it still feel like them. So for me, I think that's all part of it too, because it's hard to write in someone else's voice. Although AI is helping us with that quite a bit now, it's going to be a lot
right.
easier to write in someone's voice in a hot minute. So that's
Yes,
good.
very true,
But
very true.
here's a good question though to kind of before we move on from this one. What about those situations where you had that great rapport with the reporter, and they actually end up not including whatever it was that your SME prepared for them? Um, should they reach out and say thank you and follow up? Should they let it lie? I personally feel like you should still, share that piece and maybe share some of what you would have, hoped to have seen included. Like in
Yes.
LinkedIn, for example, you can share more.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good question. So, I mean, I think you want to think about it in two ways. Like, first of all, you may have done an interview or shared commentary with a reporter that, and for whatever reason, maybe that commentary didn't get used, or it's very possible that it got cut in the editing process. So it's not even always the writer's fault. And
Yeah.
regardless, again, you want to think of it as a relationship, and so I think you should always be gracious, thank them for the opportunity. And of course, if the article is still relevant to your business and it still has some great feedback in it, like by all means, I think sharing articles that are relevant to your business from reporters that you want to have a relationship with is always a smart strategy. But I think the other piece of it is that you mentioned is, I know I have a system where I save especially if it's done in writing, I save every bit of commentary that we provide or that a client provides to publication, and I save it on a Google Drive. And so
Same.
even if it doesn't get used, then it's something you can go back to and you can turn it into a blog post or a social post. So, I mean, you should not ever consider it a wasted opportunity because you can reuse that content somewhere.
And if you're not reusing it, then you're making extra work for yourself as opposed to getting more for your time and for your thought leaders' time, because you only get so much
Absolutely.
time with them. So you want to make the most of it. Um,
Absolutely. And I always try and say that up front is that, I try and you have to prepare clients and say, this may happen, right? You may submit commentary, it may not be used, but don't ever think of it as a wasted opportunity because we are gathering for the fodder for other content that can be used. You can use it elsewhere and repurpose it. So
100%. And how do you feel about recording those interviews? Obviously, with the consent of the reporter, like using something like Otter so that you have a transcript. So that way, even if the PR team, for example, isn't able to attend the call, that they can actually, hear the conversation and better yet, have that written record.
yeah,
Is that
I
something
mean,
you normally do?
I don't do it a lot, but honestly, it really comes down to the fact that, it depends on if the reporter is okay with it.
Right.
And so many reporters these days just want it via in writing.
Yeah.
So I'm just seeing a lot more of that versus verbal conversations these days. So it's really just a matter of it's just not happening as much. But I
Yeah,
definitely think it's something that if the reporter is okay with it, sure. I mean, it cannot hurt. And at the very least listen in on it because I've definitely listened in on interviews where maybe the CEO or the founder or somebody in the company has done an interview with a reporter and they only end up using one part of it, but you'll pick up ideas or you'll learn things in that you think, oh, I got to come back to that, like maybe we can explore that in a blog post or I can pitch this angle. So it's always helpful to at least listen in even if you can't record it.
totally agreed. And I will admit that on occasion, when it's a really great interview and I hear my thought leader like miss an opportunity to talk about something that to me as a writer would be super relevant, I will jump in and say, and now, you're being a little modest here because you didn't mention, and I'll mention
Yes.
whatever it is. And then if the reporter's interested, they'll bite. And then my person, can talk to it. Cause I have some clients who are they're not self promotional. They're
Which
just
is so funny, and
really,
that's the flip side of what we talked about before, right? Some aren't promotional enough, and so then it comes down to the training of like, how do you sort of remember to get those sound bites in when they're appropriate? Not being
exactly.
obnoxious about it, but I think it definitely can go both ways. You have to have that right balance of promotion and being helpful. So
Agreed. So, one of the other kind of big buckets of thought leadership is typically speaking engagements. So, sometimes that's like small local, meetups, but it can also be like big, national or international conferences, industry events. What do you see the role of those kinds of events and, helping your subject matter experts get those speaking engagements? Like, where does that fit into the brand content strategy, and how do you even get started with, with the projects with some of the clients?
yes. Well, and I'll give you my own personal take on this. And I will say that, I have a lot of conversations with those of us in PR and sometimes the speaker strategy and pitching clients for speaking is part of what we do, but a lot of times it isn't necessarily.
Yeah.
It sometimes ends up being this separate thing or somebody else is handling that. But I do think that, ideally you're working hand in hand with, whoever is doing that if you're not doing it for them. I mean, look, I think that it's always smart to start with maybe things like providing commentary or interviews with reporters or doing podcasts because I think that like getting up on stage is a big deal for some people, so I think
Yeah.
you kind of want to start and hone your skills a little bit in other areas of public relations, and also that I think that helps you figure out okay, which topics are really just kind of shining for me, right?
Yeah.
Which are the things that I'm really gravitating towards that I feel very comfortable speaking about. But I think that if you've got somebody who's comfortable going there, I mean, it can be a huge asset because you're essentially taking a lot of the same topics that you're already talking about, kind of turning it into a topic that you feel comfortable doing live. And I think the experience of, if you get at the right, trade show or conference where, your customers are, I think, seeing someone live, I mean, it's just like live music, right? Seeing someone
Yeah.
live, just no kind of substitute for that. It's different, right? You have
Yeah.
that personal connection, that higher level of trust, and connection. And so I think that, it's always great to get there. And I think maybe sometimes where it tends to intersect with PR more often is, you find that a lot of the trade magazines that we might be pitching,
Mhm.
have events attached to them. So then, you might be pitching these editors that are also sort of involved in the trade shows, and you may work your way into a speaking opportunity. So, I mean, that's been my experience
Yeah.
personally. But I definitely think the effectiveness of it can be fantastic as long as you're really paying attention to who the audience is at some of these events, and how important is that going to be to your business, and then how comfortable does the person feel speaking live. So
Totally. So I'm also a huge fan of getting them to do those events that they can do in person, because although certainly virtual events are easier from a logistics, scheduling, et cetera, you don't have, as many kind of related marketing and PR opportunities. Because for example, when you're at one of these events, you're inevitably quite probably going to run into a reporter, or if you have a reporter you've spoken to previously, you can schedule time to grab coffee with them, or sit next to them at a session or something that it's that kind of back in the day, you used to take a reporter out to a fancy lunch and chat them up if you're in comms. But now I feel like the conferences are really pretty much the only time you're going to see some of these people in person.
yeah, no, that's true. And I mean, I feel like, obviously we had a few years ago where that just few years where that just wasn't happening. And now I
Yeah.
feel like, live events are kind of coming back. So I see that being a bigger focus going forward. And to your point, you're right. It's a great place to go meet up with media. I don't know if you remember, back again, taking it back to the music days, but going to South by Southwest every year was like the time that you met with all of the reporters in the music industry. Like everybody went. We had these big sort of dinners, and it was kind of the one time of the year that you could go and network in person with people that lived all over the country, but that all, wrote about music. So
Yeah. So what do you say though if you have that thought leader who, okay, you get them that speaking gig, and you pre-promote it and all that kind of good stuff, and it goes really well, but they just want to go in, present, and leave. Like, do you have any kind of like final like words of encouragement, or like any sort of tips for how do you deal with that? Because I think sometimes your speakers just are so focused on their business and their work, which is understandable, but they maybe don't quite get the opportunity in the way that PR and marketing professionals do.
right. Yeah, I mean, I think it just comes down to education. I think, we were talking earlier about, when you are pitching reporters for media opportunities, like a lot of the, you kind of got to lay the groundwork before and engage with the reporters. And then once they run your story, you have to share it and you have to engage with them after the fact. And so I think you have to look at the speaking engagements the same way. You've got people in the audience that might have loved what you had to say, and some of them might be potential customers. Like a
Yeah.
lot of it is sticking around and, engaging afterwards, whether it's in the comments or live or whatever. I think it's just an education that it's not just about the moment, it's about what happens before and what happens afterwards as well.
Yeah, the whole experience, just like
Whole
customer
experience,
experience,
right? It's relationship
not just
building.
the
I mean,
sale.
that's what, it's people buy from people, right? They always say that. So you have to be out there as the face or representative of your company, and you have to engage with people. That's just part of the deal.
And that's such the perfect segue into what I wanted to talk to you about next, which is about newsjacking, because
Ah,
we've
yes.
all been in those situations where there's something that it's all everyone's talking about. Like, let's say Barbie. I love Barbie. I've talked about Barbie so much as an adult woman in the last month. I never would have guessed that I would be talking about, my decade of playing with Barbies and how much I loved Barbie. But it is what it is. And people, it resonated for folks because it was authentic. It was me. I was that little girl who, sewed clothes for her Barbies and built, apartment buildings out of boxes. A little, it's a little quirky, a little weird, 100% me. And people thought it was hilarious to just see my personality was already so set in stone as a 6-year-old. But frequently that's not the case when we see brand newsjacking. We see SMEs try to glom onto a trend, and it feels more like when you're watching that Progressive commercial, and you have the guy who's trying to get everyone excited about, well, I'm standing in front of our secret customer's dream house, and I'd like to tell you who her boyfriend is, but I don't think I can. And then nobody laughs, and so he says it again, and we all cringe. We're like, oh, the dad joke, it's so terrible. What do you do? Like, how can you be authentic and find those right moments and encourage them to just zip it when it's not the right
Yes.
opportunity?
Oh gosh. Well, yes. So I think that, obviously when you're talking about, I guess, softer news, I feel like, yes, that's when you want to look for opportunities to, be a part of a trend. And again, not to force fit it, but I mean, those are opportunities for you. I think the times where you really want to be careful is, you don't want to capitalize on someone's tragedy, right? And I
Yes.
think that that's where we see sometimes people go very wrong, and they just really, will upset reporters or the public, with just trying to insert themselves into a situation that is tragic for some people. So, I mean, again, I think this is when you really want to make sure that you've got, that the CEO or the founder or the C-suite is checking in with your PR department and your comms department on things and making sure they're running things past them before they decide to engage. But I'm an advocate is if you think that it might possibly piss people off or hit the wrong note, like I would just say, don't do it. Right. This is when you want to err on the side of caution. Um, we all as PR people engage in a lot of Facebook groups and we're part of groups where reporters will, send out queries when they need a subject matter expert for a particular article. And so maybe you can sort of more passively step back and sort of see who's asking for expertise, and then you can
Yeah.
offer your assistance. But I don't think, if it's one of those things where you're not sure, I would say err on the side of caution and maybe just avoid it. So.
Yeah, because there's nothing worse than spending a bunch of time and energy on something that isn't going to fly. It's not going to be well received, and then you're going to be the one handling the blame end of things. It's not going to be your subject matter expert who's like,
Exactly.
"Oh, bad decision on my part." You really have to be the
Yeah.
one who dissuades them, at least
And
in
I
my
think maybe that also comes back to, I mean, this is way precedes that is just making sure that you have the kind of relationship with your client, or if it's an internal thing where your comms person is respected and you're not going to get yourself in a situation, you want to set the ground rules of engagement up front. And, you're there for a reason, is to provide wise counsel and sort of take the temperature on, is this situation going to get me in some hot water or not, and so you don't want to work with someone that's always going rogue. Let's put it that way.
Totally. And I mean, it's the same with on social media, how you have some brands that every single observance or holiday, et cetera, they want to post about it. And you really have to just come back and ask people, how is this relevant to our business and what we provide? Because if it sounds inauthentic, it's just going to be a problem. The
Yeah.
example of if you're talking about Veterans Day, but your company has a track record of not, being really great
Yes.
for supporting veterans, then don't say Happy Veterans Day on your social media because you're going to be
Absolutely.
inviting criticism. Or,
Yes.
don't have a 9/11 sale. There was a travel company one year that had a
Oh my
9/11 sale.
God. Oh my goodness.
And you're
Yeah.
like,
See.
no.
Oh. Yeah. I just, you don't have to weigh in on everything. I know we want to take advantage of holidays and, link to what's in the news, but yes, there comes a point when, if it's not relevant to your brand, or if it's offensive, or, going to be triggering for something, you don't want to do it. So.
Exactly. And I wish these were not conversations we ever had to have as comms professionals, but you do, because
Yes.
inevitably sometimes people just get caught up in the zeitgeist, caught up in the moment, and they're not thinking straight. They're thinking, what a great opportunity for us to tell everybody
Exactly.
about whatever this thing is. And you're like, no.
Yes. No, it is not a great opportunity.
So
Yes.
I think we've covered a lot of them, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what some of the other kind of big challenges are when you're whether you're a content marketer or a PR professional. What are some of the kind of common challenges that you have to work on overcoming with your thought leaders in order to help them be successful?
Oh gosh, I do think we've talked about a lot of them. I mean, I'm probably reiterating a couple of them, but just, the whole idea of too much selling, not enough helping. You know, Trying to delegate, some of the thought leadership. I think that's just, I think you really have to strike that balance of, if you need help, find ways for people to help you without just completely giving away like what your secret sauce is. You're the one that is trying to, share your unique expertise, and that really can't be done by somebody else. Um, I would say, you know, just being lazy, too lazy about it. I think just, people are coming to you for that your unique take on things and your unique point of view on something, right? And so, don't just kind of give a really basic answer if a reporter asks you a question. I think you've got to just, always sort of be elevating, what you're saying and making sure that it relates back to your personal experience. Trying to think what else. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things you really have to just, I'd say, put in the time and be patient, right? It does not happen overnight. Like I think, PR is one of those things. Like if you're looking, like suddenly you have a product launch and you need to like sell a ton of products tomorrow, like PR is not the way to do that, right? PR
No,
is,
you need to do some
you have to play
advertising
the
then.
long game, right? Exactly. You got to play the long game. And that means really taking time to build relationships with reporters. And, you may, I've heard stories where, somebody pitched the Today Show and got an opportunity on the Today Show like 2 years later. It's just, you've got to just be willing to put in the time, be patient, try different angles, and, play the long game. That's really it for me.
I totally agree. I mean, that's so important to remember that any kind of content marketing, whether it's thought leadership or things that you're doing on your own blog for for your audience, it takes forever to win the trust of your audience and to build up enough content that it shows that you have expertise in a specific area. When you're doing a good job of, let's say, creating content around your pillars and linking back and forth between your existing content and your new content, so that way it becomes clear to search engines and to humans that you have a deep area of expertise, that's when stuff starts to roll. And you'll end up having, to your point, I have some blog content that I've created for clients that's years old that is still generating leads for them. It's
Yeah.
still, performing well in search. And yeah, they go in and maybe they refresh a few things here and there every so often, but it keeps driving things. It's not something that just that first week is it. That's just so, it's not like, broadcast television where it's just that moment primarily that people were looking at in the past. And it's not one and done, and it's not necessarily so time bound. So I think that is a really important thing to mention.
Yep.
Um, I'm looking here and it looks like I haven't seen any questions come in yet through LinkedIn, but we do have some time if folks have any questions for either of us about building a thought leadership platform and working with this SMEs. Um, I'm wondering, so Kathy, I know reporters are wanting stuff in writing, but when it comes to you working with your clients, how are you primarily, getting the info you need for that written content? Are you finding that more of your subject matter experts are writers, or are they doing the old recording something for you or calling you on the phone? Like, how are people giving you that feedback that then you're turning into your content?
So I think I often find that the CEOs and the founders sometimes like to do just the calls. right? And then I turn that into something. But I would say it really depends. The company I told you about, that where I work with the interior designers, I think that the writing is really mostly what they're doing. And,
Yeah,
different people are better writers than others. So, I always look at it. I will edit. If I need to get anything clarified, I'll go back to them and ask. And then I always try and give some really clear instructions on, we need to have more than just a one sentence answer, and make sure, there's always sort of those little bullets. Or if I think, if I have any just sort of little guidelines that I think will make the answers better, I'll sort of just stick them in there and say, try and focus on this, or remember to mention this. And, but I always go in and I edit. But yeah, I think a lot of them are fine with the writing, just because that's honestly how reporters want to see it. I'd say
totally.
more times than not these days. So,
And then I had one client who he had a fairly lengthy commute when he would come into the office, like a 90-minute commute. So what he loved to do is he would call my voicemail and he would talk into my voicemail,
oh,
and I
I
would
love
get like a half-hour recording where I get this
an
brain dump.
otter. That's when you really have to have the otter that help you
Yeah.
out, right? Yeah.
So that's how I honestly got started using Otter, because I can't listen to a 30-minute voicemail. I definitely have to download that, get a transcript, and read it, because I'm a reader. I'm a writer person. So
Mhm.
listening to somebody for half an hour in a recording is like not going to engage me. But having that
Yes,
and just being able to edit and pull it apart and go, oh wow, here's 5 brand new blog post ideas, and here's something we're going to
exactly.
pitch. So I love that too.
Exactly. I think it really, like, for me, it comes down to knowing the client and where I think that they shine and how they best communicate, and then taking advantage of that. Like, I have one client that I'm kind of doing a sit down with on Thursday, where we're going to go through sort of, okay, what are the topics that you see bubbling up in the industry right now, and what's your take on those? And I have another client where she just loves text. And so, if I see something in the news, some trend, and I'll shoot her a text and say, like, hey, do you have something to say about this trend? Yes, I do. So it really just depends. So,
Gotcha. Well, I'm going to take this opportunity to ask one more question before we let you go for the day. And that is, what is something that you worked on recently for a client that really just made you feel so excited and thrilled when it got, completed or picked up? Like, what was something that just really brought you joy recently from working with clients on thought leadership?
oh my gosh. What, let's see. Okay, I'll give one example. So, uh, actually, okay, let's talk about awards for a second.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, we can talk about
I
awards.
worked,
Oh my goodness.
yes, exactly. So this is, I mean, again, another sort of way of talking about thought leadership, or I would say another sort of trust signal. But um, I worked with the renovation company I talked to you about on entering for the Prop Tech Breakthrough Awards. And, they're a fairly new company, but I think just the reason that was so exciting is because they, you know, I think one of their main competitors has showed up pretty well in these awards. But we went through the whole submission process, and they just announced the other day that they are I think it was the property renovation company of the year. So
Wow,
that
that's
was
awesome.
exciting. Yeah, exactly. But I think awards can be another thing that to think about if you're looking for that additional layer of visibility with your clientele. So
Agreed. The only thing I will say as a caveat to that is you have to budget for that at the beginning of the year, because
yes,
there's always, an entrance fee. And if folks say, oh, it's pay to play, it's like, no, it's called paying somebody to sit and read all of the submissions.
the
Because if you didn't
submissions,
have,
exactly. Or it's not, and actually that's a good point, because not everybody knows that there's fees involved, and
Mhm.
sometimes they're on the back end, for the use of the symbol, or the use of the
Yeah,
the logo. So yeah, there are fees involved for some of them, but I do think it is a nice thing to be able to showcase, and again, as that
100%.
sort of just additional signal of trust for an organization or a product. So
Totally agreed. Well, Kathy, it's been so much chatting with you today. But where else can folks find you? Like, where can we hear more from you on social or on the web?
I would say I'm usually sharing most of my opinions these days on LinkedIn. So that's probably the best place to find me these days. I do show up on Twitter now and again. But yeah, I'd say LinkedIn, please come find me and let's link in with each other.
Well, I'm going to do that right after this. So again,
Okay.
thank you so much, and hope
Thank you,
everyone out
Erica.
there have a great rest of your day and a great week. Bye,
You too.
everyone.
Take care. Bye.